Here we go.
So Walter Jehne is speaking today to us on the soil-microbial root interface and the evolution, resilience, and future of life on land, how nature created soils and terrestrial biosystems, including their hydrology, our climate and functions, and what we have done to these processes and how they are now critical to our safe future. Walter Jehne is an internationally recognized soil microbiologist and innovation strategist. He has immense field and research experience in soils, grasslands, agriculture, and forests at local, national, and international levels. Walter's specialization is the role of soil microbes, symbiotic processes, and the ecology of diseases, plant health, nutrient and waste cycling, soil petagenesis, and the regeneration of biosystems. Decades of research have made him an expert in plant root ecology, mycorrhizal, fungi, glomalin, and soil carbon formation. He also has worked on biology's enormous influences in hydrological cycles, weather patterns, regional and global cooling, and cloud formation and rain precipitation. Recent work has focused on commercializing leading bio-innovations, which will urgently help restore agro-ecosystems in urban agriculture and ecologies. Walter is determined to advance the practical verification, application, and extension of these innovations, including for cities and their supply chains, to sustain the current 8 billion and projected 10 billion people by mid-century. You can find out more at www.regenerate-earth.org. And with that, I would like to say thank you and welcome.
Thank you very much, Peter. And look, thank you everybody for listening to me. I understand it's a bit early from the normal process, but let's just get into it and then let's raise issues and follow up with discussions. But let me just introduce myself very briefly. Yes, I'm a soil microbiologist from down under. I spent a lot of time in research with our premier CSIRO, our premier research institute in Australia, looking at forests, tropical crops and pastures, arid landscapes, and looking at how do we regenerate or understand the soil microbial ecology, but use that to understand nutrition, diseases, regeneration of arid biosystems. But look, I retired about 15 years ago and set up an organization called Healthy Soils Australia, with very innovative farmers, leading farmers, and really documenting the evidence and extending that innovation. But for the last 4 years, very much been involved with another group called Regenerate Earth, because this is now being taken globally, but very much into key policy decisions, carbon accounting, carbon farming, but most importantly, hydrology and naturally safely cooling the climate, because we're hitting that basically dead end. But today, because of your audience and your audience's interest and background, and of course also the very important focus in the Pacific Northwest on soil microbial ecology and fungal ecology that I know you're all aware of, I really wanted to get into a topic which is really at the guts of life, but also very important for how we're going to manage the future. And that's the soil microbial root interface. Okay, it's that, in a sense, that interface. I mean, we've had a lot of talking about the wood wide web, but it's, yes, that interface between the soil, microbes, and roots, and the symbioses that actually created and drive the biosystems and will now be fundamental in restoring our future, securing our future. It's actually the basis of life on land, and so it matters in a big way. But to have that discussion, we really want to start at the beginning. What is this interface? What is this interface about? How does it function? And we can do that if we go back to sort of basically the start, go back 4.6 billion years ago. And of course, we had a supernova that created a whole lot of bang, noise, light, vision, stardust. And that stardust collapsed and it created the 9 planets of the solar systems. The bureaucrats have dropped off Pluto, but don't worry, it's still there. It's just not big enough to hit the bureaucratic scale. And basically, it's then 4.6 billion years ago that the planets formed. But what was amazing, about 4 billion years ago, water started condensing and creating our oceans. But then 3.8 billion years ago, so really quite rapidly after the formation of the Earth, life developed. And of course, this is in a sense the first microbial life. And if we understand how that developed, then that actually gives us a blueprint for the whole of biology, ecosystem function, sustainability, and our future coming now. So I'll just flip this screen across to a little overhead. Normally I have whiteboards, but let's do this. And Peter, can we see that screen pretty clearly? Can we see that all right, Peter?
Yeah, it looks good.
Okay, good. I'm assuming
Yep.
that's right. Okay, and
Sorry, I
so
was
this is
muted.
just a very simple drawing that I've got of, in a sense, what was happening in the deep oceans around volcanic vents 3.8 billion years ago in the seawater. And of course, we had these vents and they were giving off a lot of chemicals, a lot of nutrients. And we had actually these protocells, basically micro droplets surrounded by oil films, right? Thin films of oil, which effectively acted as proto-membranes. And what these membranes were able to do was absolutely quite unique, because they were able to concentrate essential nutrients from the water around. And for example, if we look at phosphorus, there might have been 20 parts per million outside in that chemical soup that was the oceans, but they were able to concentrate phosphorus across that membrane and bring it up to higher levels, 200 parts per million, hypothetically. At the same time, these membranes were able to exclude potentially toxic elements, things like aluminium, cadmium, lead, toxic elements that were then basically detrimental. And by excluding them, where it might have been 200 parts per million outside, basically they were able to take on perhaps 20 inside. So it ended up with a completely different nutritional concentration and formulation compared to the soup outside and the concentration inside these micro droplets, these protocells. And this is really quite profound, because that gave you a completely different nutritional integrity through this selective uptake, selective concentration exclusion process. So inside we now had completely different biochemistry. And then basically there's some recent work, or about 10 years ago, published in Nature, which sort of said, look, if we have this situation, then by definition, we have a massive difference in the electrical potential across this membrane. Now, the electrical potential is, in a sense, the charge difference over the distance. And of course, we've got this fairly large charge difference, but we've got this very, very small angstrom thick distance. So you end up with massive electrical potentials across this membrane. And of course, that gave you all the energy that drives biochemical life. So we now had protocells that were basically completely different chemical composition, but also completely different energetics. And in a sense, that was the biochemical basis for life. And then this only had to happen once, right, throughout history, universe. And then, of course, this cell grows, buds off, and of course, from that evolves microbial life in the oceans. Now, we're starting at this point 3.8 billion years ago, because it's giving us the whole first template of what life's about. It's about this membrane interface, okay? The power of these membrane interfaces. Okay, so that's really the start of life. And then very, very rapidly, of course, microbial life developed in the oceans. About 3.5 billion years ago, photosynthesis evolved. And that's basically these cells being able to say, look, I can absorb sunlight and I can turn that sunlight, CO2 and water into sugars through photosynthesis. And of course, if I have sugars, then I'm producing, again, substrate within these cells to keep on driving life. And so from about 3.5 billion years ago, we then had these chloroplasts, or these photosynthetic blue-green algae, and they were able to then start generating a lot more sugar, food substrates, to enable them to grow exponentially much, much faster. They, of course, by photosynthesis, were also producing oxygen as a waste product. And of course, that oxygen then fundamentally changed the geology, oxidized all the iron, oxidized all the reduced elements, and then progressively increased the oxygen concentration in the atmosphere. So microbial life, right from those early days, was basically created itself through this separation, through this interface, but then photosynthesis drove all these geochemical changes. And so that oxygen in the atmosphere then enabled very rapidly, about 1.5 billion years ago, for eukaryotic cells to form. These are primitive prokaryotic cells, but then you had basically symbioses, organelles coming together and making more complex cells, eukaryotic cells. Lynn Margulis talks about that very much in her symbiosis work. But also then that oxygen enabled multicellular organisms to also form about 700 million years ago, to the extent that by 500 million years ago, there was a very, very vibrant biological colonization of the ocean. Lots of animals and, jellyfish and scorpions and all these sorts of animals had started to evolve. And they were very, very competitively looking for nutrients, because nutrients became the limiting factor. They had sugar from the photosynthesis, but now nutrients were limiting. So about 420 million years ago, along come fungi. I mean, fungi are basically been around, but really it's the membrane hyphal tubes of fungi that were actually profoundly important in allowing life to grow from the estuarine edges onto the rocky land. Up to 420 million years ago, there was no life on land. It was just bare, hard, arid rock. And of course, the oceans had life, but the fungi enabled life to colonize the land, to solubilize these nutrients. But of course, fungi are like us, they're animals, and therefore they can't photosynthesize. So the fungi had to form symbioses with blue-green algae to form lichens. And even now, all over the planet, we see these lichens solubilizing rocks. And because they can now have solubilization plus carbon fixation from the algae, these lichens can live independently, autonomously. And so these lichens then totally transformed the earth and really created Petagenesis, the formation of soils. Because as these lichens and fungi grew in the soil, they left behind organic detritus, their cell walls effectively, and then progressively, by adding carbon to the soil, creating mineral detritus, or transforming mineral detritus into healthy soils. And it's, again, very simply and illustrated by this little diagram, whereas rock has got a high bulk density, 2.6 to 3.5 grams per cc, very little airspace, water holding capacity, nutrient availability, etc. As carbon gets sequestered into these rocks by these microbial processes, you can see that it actually is creating a three-dimensional matrix. You can draw it as little bed springs holding these mineral particles apart and actually creating the Earth's soil carbon sponge. And the sponge is the word sponge is critical because basically the bulk density in a healthy soil is 1.2, 1.1 grams per cc. So you can basically see this as healthy soil. 60% of its volume is actually air, nothing. So we create healthy soils by adding nothing, by just adding bed springs, carbon bed springs to separate and make that soil a porous, open sponge. But it's by creating that open, porous sponge structure that we fundamentally change its functional properties. And this is, in a sense, the whole power of natural farming, zero budget farming, which I know you'll be talking about later today, because basically by adding nothing, just by creating that physical three-dimensional structure, we're increasing the aeration. So over 50% of this soil is now aeration. It's a habitat perfect for active microbial life. Water, it's actually able to hold 60% of its weight as water. So it's able to infiltrate, retain, make available water. By basically creating this three-dimensional open aerated structure, we're also massively increasing the availability of nutrients, because now all the mineral surfaces are exposed, available for the solubilization and uptake of nutrients, whereas before, of course, they were all locked up, unavailable. We've massively increased the rootability of this soil, i.e. roots can proliferate to depth. And so instead of being limited to 5 centimeters of soil, 2 inches of soil on the surface, we can now exploit 3-4 meters of soil. So the volume of soil mineral resources available is profoundly increased. And of course, basically, we can increase the microbial activity of that soil. And it's really now this living soil, which has enormous lengths of fungal hyphae and billions of microbial cells living in it. Okay, up to 25,000 kilometers of fungal hyphae per cubic meter of healthy soils. Billions of bacteria, actinomycetes, protozoa, fungi, etc., per gram of soil. So it's a living, vibrant biosystem. And that's what petagenesis is. It's taking mineral detritus into living soils. And it's a paradigm change. But of course, it's that paradigm change that has been absolutely critical in the evolution of land. Because by having water, nutrients, aeration, rootability, basically nature was able to evolve ever more efficient plant systems. So we went from these fungi, the lichens, to mosses, to ferns, to liverworts, before ferns, cycads, gymnosperms, angiosperms, and of course grasses. But also nature was able to then colonize, vegetate all the 14 billion hectares of ice-free land on this planet. And of course, it was able to use this petagenesis process repeatedly after volcanization, meteorite impacts, or glaciation, for example, to regenerate healthy soils. And of course, we've seen that, you guys will see that so clearly where you are. After the last ice age, we had glacial till, we had waterlogged, glacial mineral detritus, and within 10,000 years, nature has turned that glacial till through petagenesis into some of the world's most productive deep soils. So your prairie soils, 8% carbon, 10 meters deep, productivity, resilience, and it's just abundance. And so petagenesis, these membrane interfaces, these microbial membrane interfaces, these three-dimensional living matrices, the sponges in soil, are fundamental. And of course, that's then really what we inherited as civilization at the start of the Holocene 10,000 years ago. But of course, we humans have been then very, very aggressive. And of course, we've been clearing, burning, cultivating, over-fertilizing, overgrazing, using biocides, using irrigation, and also using bare fallowing. And of course, each of these activities of ours, which is what we call civilization, has been, in a sense, oxidizing these bed springs, this carbon from the soil. And of course, has been progressively collapsing these healthy soil structures back to actually a much more compacted, degraded soil substrate. And in that process, losing all this natural functionality. Okay, in response to that, we've been actually then saying, okay, we're forced to have additions. We're forced to add nutrients because the natural nutrient availability from surface exposure is no longer there. So we're now into more on agriculture, more on fertilizer, more cultivation, more biocides, more irrigation. We've become dependent on these artificial inputs, but all of them are oxidizing and degrading these bed springs, this soil carbon, taking that soil back to a much, much more degraded state. And so really, this is now the imperative before humanity. How do we actually turn this around? How do we regenerate the Earth's soil carbon sponge? How do we regenerate healthy biosystems? As basically you said, Peter, there's 8 billion of us on the planet at the moment. There'll be 10 billion by 2050. 70% of them were living in cities, but we all need food. We all need water. We all need biosystems and habitat. 7 missed meals is what separates social stability from chaos. 7 missed meals. And so basically, we've got to really look at the thing, how do we regenerate the fundamental biosystems we depend on so that we can actually keep that social stability in that projected 10 billion. Okay, and so that becomes our clear imperative and challenge. How do we rebuild healthy soils? This little diagram here is really, again, reinforcing more or less functionally what I was saying before. If you have a degraded soil, as we have with agriculture, and this is a hydrograph, this is a simple water flow from landscapes in time. You see, if we have a degraded soil, then we've got this massive flood peak, and we lose all that water from the soil. So we have floods, erosion, loss, risk, costs because of the floods. But by definition, we have now designed in drought, erosion, death, risk, and cost, and conversion of that biosystem to desertified landscapes simply by letting that water escape. You see, and so this desertification degradation is really a function, it's a consequence of our land management. It's nothing to do with nature. We have created it by letting this water escape. Conversely, if we bring that soil carbon up to the 3% level, which is again very, very modest, we end up with a completely different hydrograph. So instead of all the water running off, it will now infiltrate. Sure, some will run off, but most of it will infiltrate in the soil carbon sponge and get stored in our in-soil reservoirs. And that's profound because that allows us to extend the longevity of green growth. So when you think of here, the longevity of green growth in the degraded system, maybe 10 days after a 2-inch rainfall event, if we've got the regenerated soil, we've got a longevity of green growth that may not be 10 days, it may be 150 days, 15 times that. So that's 1,500% productivity dividend because of this longevity of green growth. And all our practices, natural farming practices and what have you, are about building soil carbon to extend the longevity of green growth in our biosystems, producing more productive biosystems without having to sort of add to them. So this is really the functional dividends from rebuilding healthy soils, going from 0.3 to 3, but getting these enormous resilience, productivity dividends through natural farming. So the question comes, how do we do this? How do we actually now regenerate our soils? And of course, we started off with petagenesis. We started off with the microbial interface, And the answer is yes, nature's got that solution, and we can actually take that solution on ourselves. And it's very simple, and to bring it down to very simple terms, it's as much as A, B, and C, right? A is about agriculture. It's about maximizing agriculture, which we're extremely good at, maximizing above ground plant photosynthetic capacity. No issue with that. We can basically do that right across the planet. We can do that at rates of up to 200 tons per hectare per annum, for example, sugarcane. But what's important is not just A. See, A is really what we're focused on in agriculture, but it's only a very small part of the game. The really critical thing is what happens to every gram of biomass that we fix through A. And there's only two things that can happen to it. There's only two things that have happened to it right throughout history of the planet. It can either burn, it can oxidize back to CO2 rapidly, and it does that if we, of course, use our oxidative burning, cultivation, over-fertilization, biocides, fallowing strategies, and we can basically lose all of A, or even all of A plus heritage legacy carbon from the soil, which is in a sense what we've been doing, which is in a sense why we get the rising CO2 in the atmosphere. And so we've had an industrial agriculture, sure, that's tried to maximize growth, but by doing so, we've had all these moron inputs that drive up oxidation. And in fact, we're just eating soil capital. We're degrading and eating our capital. We're going into the territory that President Roosevelt warned us about. A nation that destroys its soils destroys itself. And so this is, in a sense, the agricultural system above the ground that we've been using for the last 70 years that radically has to be redesigned. And how does it have to be redesigned? Well, basically, we have to move down under. And basically, instead of burning it, we've got to say there's another balancing process that nature's got, which is carbon biosequestration. We can take the carbon from A, the carbon fixed in A, and we can put 70% of that into stable soil carbon. And we do that through basically stimulating the fungal systems that are involved with actually converting this biomass into stable soil carbon, either humus or glomalin. Okay, and we already have enormous competitive advantage in doing that because unbeknown to us, or most of us, only 30% of the biomass produced by agriculture is actually above the ground. 70% is already below ground in roots and root exudates. And what we have to do is we have to re-stimulate the soil fungi that are responsible for basically turning these roots into the humus, the root exudates, which have been taken up by the mycorrhizal fungi largely and left behind as glomalin, that initial petagenesis organic detritus that we talked about earlier. So really it's a matter of managing the ratios of B and C. I mean, obviously some B is natural, and obviously if we didn't have it, we'd run out of carbon dioxide to draw down from photosynthesis. But at the moment, instead of oxidizing 120% of A, we've got to put 70% of A, 60% of A into stable soil carbon, rebuilding that soil carbon sponge, that matrix, that hygrograph response that we saw about just a minute ago. Okay, so it's us through our land management, our farming management that govern the ratio B and C, and we can switch that dramatically to enhance C through natural farming and, of course, fungal microbial processes. And this is, of course, where the interface comes in, because the interface is all about, as nature had it, developing carbon or growing these fungi and converting this biomass into humus and glomalin through these membrane interfaces, these fungal interfaces. There's another void here, or another space here, which is, again, profoundly important, but we've really talked about it partly in our hydrograph data. because for every gram of carbon that we put into the soil as C, we get a dividend. We get a multiplier. So it's like a positive feedback force multiplier system. For every gram of carbon we put in, we get 8 to 20 grams of extra water holding capacity in that soil, which extends longevity of green growth, productivity, as we've talked about. For every gram of carbon we put in the soil, we increase its nutrient availability, its biofertility, without having to add extra nutrients. We increase its rootability, the volume of soil available. We increase the microbial cycling of those nutrients. So again, bioproductivity increases, as in a rainforest, not by the addition of nutrients, simply by their speed of cycling. And we've got a whole lot of issues as far as improved pest, disease resistance, productivity, resilience. So basically, ABC gives us a toolkit, the toolbox, as in nature, for regenerating healthy soils. And that's now the critical thing we've got to do. Now, innovative farmers all over the world, you've got them, your Gabe Browns, your Dave Johnsons, we've got them in Australia, we've got them in Europe, we've got them in India with zero budget natural farming and what have you. These innovative leaders, they're basically sequestering up to 10 tons of carbon per hectare per annum through managing their BC ecologies. Okay, that's 10 tons of carbon rebuilding the Earth's soil carbon sponge. It doesn't matter if you can't do 10 straight away. Nature does up to 100 tons, but that's not the issue. The fact is that you've just got to change. I'm doing more of C and less of B, and as long as you're on that journey, that counts. But also what it matters, and this is in a sense now coming to the big picture globally, it also comes really the guts of what we have to do globally, and we're running out of time. We've only got about a decade to do this in. Now, this is the Keeling curve, right? Remember Charles Keeling in the 1960s made that point. Look, CO2 is growing, increasing abnormally on this planet because of this oxidation of soils, landscapes, including, of course, our use of fossil fuels. But basically, CO2 is going up abnormally, and this is going to be a crisis for the planet. And we've seen the sawtooth graph. You've all seen that. Look, it goes up in winter and it comes down in spring and summer. But you probably haven't seen the mathematics of this, because every year there's some 250 billion tons of carbon that are in this flux. 130 billion tons is being emitted, and about 120 billion tons of carbon every year globally is being biosequestered, which means there's about a 10 billion tons carbon per annum deficit, which of course is why carbon is going up. So we have disturbed the balance between oxidation and drawdown, B and C. Okay, and it's basically we've done that on a global level. But the important point to notice, we've got 250 billion tons to play with in this sandpit. And the fossil fuel emissions that we've focused on for the last 50 years as a bad guy, I mean, not that we don't have to reduce fossil fuels, but they represent 8 billion tons. So 4% of this 250 billion ton flux is fossil fuel. And they're far, far more important, but also potentially manageable savings and efficiencies so that we can get to a 20 billion tons per annum drawdown capacity by managing that 250 billion tons more efficiently. Okay, so we can get to 10 billion tons of negative net emissions. If we can draw down 20 billion and we've got a deficit of 10, we can go to 10 billion tons carbon net negative emissions by 2030. Okay, so we can actually turn this whole graph around and get carbon going back down, because we can manage not just the emission reductions way beyond fossil fuel use, but we can actually enhance the biosequestration of carbon through natural farming, land regeneration practices. As a case in point, which is particularly important to the West Coast of the US, Australia, but now all over the planet, you see, of these emissions that we don't count at the moment are, for example, the emissions from forest fires, and that's just one category. Every year, some 350 million hectares of forest burn, 10% of our residual forests on the planet, 10%. And basically these emissions from those fires between 20 and 200 tons per hectare exceed all our fossil fuel emissions every year. So by avoiding wildfires, forest wildfires, we can offset all the emissions from fossil fuels. We can contribute about 10 billion tons of carbon saved emissions in that 20 billion ton target. And of course, we have to do that because if we don't stop these fires, they're taking our whole land systems, our biosystems, effectively back to deserts. Okay, so we have really powerful agency, powerful potential through land management practices, natural farming practices, to actually draw down carbon, reduce emissions, and really achieve this 20 billion tons per annum target. But we've got to do that not just for carbon accounting's sake, right? This is, again, where the world has just got itself in a dead end, black hole, pointless. The whole critical point of this is that we've got to put that carbon back into the soils to rebuild the soil carbon sponge, right? To rebuild that matrix, that bed spring matrix of soil structure, because it's that carbon sponge that governs the Earth's climate. Now, this is a complicated model. You don't need to look at all parts of it, but basically it's from the Swedish Academy of Science in the 1970s, and it's more or less making the pattern that here is all the heat fluxes on the planet, 100% heat coming in from the sun all the time, and this is in a sense what happens to it. But what it's trying to represent really is very simple, that 95% of the heat dynamics of the blue planet is driven by water. The carbon dioxide component of the greenhouse effect drives about 4% of that global heat dynamics. Okay, so we've got a 20-fold difference in a sense, power agency through managing water on this planet and managing water to naturally, safely cool the planet. Now, we've got to do that. We've got perhaps 10 years. We've had all the crises. We've had the failure of COP26. And basically, we're not going to get anywhere by just simply carbon accounting. They're just empty political promises. But even if they were real, they are literally decades too little, too late. You know, we're going to go well into meltdown, 4 to 6 degrees warming on this planet if we stay just on that carbon curve. We've got to actually manage that carbon to build the sponge, to regenerate the sponge, to regenerate hydrology, to really kick in now these natural hydrological cooling processes. Now, we're not going to go through them all. This is getting a bit noisy. It is, because it's complicated. There's many processes, but I just wanted to illustrate, for example, simply by trees growing, by plants transpiring, they are taking heat from the surface, 590 calories of heat energy per gram of water transpired is needed to transform that water from liquid to gas. And that 590 calories is cooling the land's surface. And it is taking that heat up into the air from where, when it condenses, a lot of it goes back out to space. This transpiration, this evapotranspiration, cools the planet, or cools 24% of the incident solar radiation from the sun. Okay, so basically 24% of that incoming heat energy is naturally dissipated through transpiration vegetation, evaporation, this cooling effect. So theoretically, a 4% increase in transpiration would more or less offset the abnormal warming that we've basically instigated today. We've got about 3 watts per square meter. There's 342 watts per square meter coming in, and we've abnormally heated the planet 3 to 4 watts per square meter today. So basically, we can cool the planet safely and naturally just by increasing the longevity of green plant cover, that longevity of that transpiration cooling effect. And so there's a whole sequence of other processes, as that water in the air is actually coalesced into cloud droplets. These cloud droplets again reflect 33% of the incident solar radiation directly back out to space. Again, enormously cooling the land below by some 120 watts per square meters. So we know that when a cloud comes over, it gets cloudy, it gets colder, we put on a jumper. So these natural, safe cooling processes, but they're all hydrological. And we can actually manage those, and we can restore those naturally and safely, rapidly, by regenerating the Earth's soil carbon sponge. We can actually do something actually even more profound by increasing the longevity of green plant growth over the land's surface, 365 days of the year. We can actually keep soil temperatures much, much, much cooler. We'll go back to this other graph which illustrates it. And if we keep the soil temperatures cooler, at 20 degrees rather than the 60, 70 degrees centigrade that soils will heat up to if they're bare, exposed, and arid, then we can vastly decrease this re-radiation of heat from the Earth's surface up into the atmosphere. And that's simply physics of Stefan Boltzmann blackbody radiative physics. The amount of re-radiation is proportional to the 4th power of the soil temperature in degrees Kelvin. So we can massively reduce that re-radiation of heat. And it's this re-radiation of heat which, of course, drives the greenhouse effect. The greenhouse effect is the amount of re-radiation of heat and then the percentage of that is absorbed by greenhouse gases. But by turning down the re-radiation of the heat, we can effectively turn down the greenhouse effect. We can do that rapidly within a matter of weeks, and we can do it irrespective of how many greenhouse gases are in the air, because obviously greenhouse gases can't absorb heat that hasn't been re-radiated. So it's turning off the stove from ultra high to simmer through effective land management action. Okay, so we have these very, very powerful, safe, natural cooling processes, hydrological cooling processes, but all of them rely on water. All of them rely on the availability of water from landscapes. And of course, they all rely on the soil carbon sponge, our regeneration of that soil carbon sponge, because without that, we don't have hydrology, we don't have natural safe cooling. And of course, that's then so critical. How do we regenerate the sponge? How do we do A, B, C to actually rebuild the health of these biosystems? I just wanted to come into this briefly about fire versus fungi, because it's so typical, it's so relevant to you guys in the Pacific Northwest. And basically, you see, we have wildfires that are now going to impact, intensify, and risk actually taking out biosystems, even in the Pacific Northwest. We've got a really scared. Will the British Columbian cool wet forests regenerate back to cool wet forests, or will they degrade into more aridified, desiccated systems? And of course, these wildfires depend on fuel. But nature, of course, manages fires not with water bombers and helicopters and all that sort of stuff. Nature does it very, very simply. It does it through fungi. Okay, it does it by taking fungi and stimulating the activity and converting all that fire fuel into stable soil carbon. Okay, so you can think of a forest, and here's all the litter, and the question is, does the litter accumulate as dry litter, as fire fuel, or is it biodegraded rapidly by the fungi into stable soil carbon? And of course, if it is converted into stable soil carbon, it's actually holding more water. And so by basically holding more water, it's actually lowering the fire risk in that country. And so we've obviously acutely aware of this in Australia. And so now the question is, can we have these biological fire breaks? Can we have microbial fire protection strategies where we're basically accelerating these microbial conversion of fire fuels into stable soil carbon to hold more water, to effectively create, even on 1% of the land area, these hydrated, composted, organic fire break zones, which then allows us, of course, to backburn safely from those zones to limit and prevent wildfires. Okay, so we're taking litter from fire break roads and tracks, we're making these swales, we're biodigesting, accelerating the biogestion in this swale, we're creating lower fuel, we're creating a hydrated region underneath, and that allows us now to control fires which were otherwise impossible and will burn literally hundreds of millions of hectares of land. Okay, so basically soil, carbon, sponges, fungi, here we are basically being used strategically, naturally as a fire prevention strategy. And basically we're out of time, we're out of resources, we can't stop these fires now. Well, certainly not in a fire extreme period, but this is all preventative action. But this is now the only way that we have any hope in hell of avoiding that meltdown, avoiding those intensive wildfires. Now, look, I want to come to perhaps the last key topic that's really important and really brings us right back to the beginning of the actual membrane interface, you know, the critically important of that soil microbial plant interface and why it's so critical. Basically, sorry?
Could I interrupt you for a second, Walter?
Yeah.
Your video stopped.
Please. Video stop.
Yeah, for a second there.
Oh, okay.
It's back on now, though.
Back on now.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, I'll swing it around again.
All right, thank you.
Right. You got all that?
Yep.
Okay, and this is basically critically important because this is, in a sense, the difference, the fundamental difference between how nature takes up nutrients from soils compared to how we're doing it with our industrial hydroponics. Okay, and as we've sort of said, basically nature took up nutrients from the soil through concentrating and excluding mineral uptake across these membrane interfaces. Remember, we went back 3.8 billion years, and here was that membrane, and here's the active, intelligent concentration and excluding, making sure that the nutrients inside this living system were different from the outside. And we also made the point there's 25,000 kilometers of hyphae that proliferate per cubic meter of healthy soil, twice the diameter of the earth per cubic meter of healthy soil. And these are all membrane tubes, all of them selectively, intelligently concentrating essential nutrients, excluding toxins. And so it's this membrane interface that is really the quality control system in what the nutrients they're getting, but also what the nutrients are they are giving to the plant. Okay, so this plant under natural system has a completely nutrient integrity, nutrient concentration selected through these membrane interfaces. since the Second World War, we have fundamentally changed that, because what we've done in terms of trying to increase productivity because of our moron agriculture, we've basically been adding biocides, over-fertilizing, cultivating, all the things we talked about, and that's effectively wiped out these microbial interfaces between the soil and the plants that are doing this intelligent selective uptake. And instead of that, our plants now are reliant on taking up nutrients just through their roots, but their roots have got a fraction of the surface area and proliferation capacity. And basically these roots are just taking up their nutrients effectively from the soil solution. And of course, that's okay for soluble ions, the ions that are in the soil solution, your nitrate, sulfate, sodium, and of course, in acid conditions, your aluminium and cadmium, etc., which is toxic, so be careful. But they're not able to access most of the cations, the essential cations, the zinc, the selenium, the phosphorus, the magnesium, the manganese, that are all locked up onto soil surfaces and organic matter surfaces, adsorbed onto charges on those surfaces. So basically, plants in this industrial hydroponics are just getting nutrients from what we're adding, the NPK, as soluble nutrients, but often very, very little or none of the other essential ions that we need for health and life. We humans, as we saw back 3.8 billion years ago, all life needs about 50 essential nutrients from the periodic table for our biochemistry and preventative health. And at the moment, we're getting a super saturated food or plant system with all these soluble nutrients, including some toxins, but a massive deficiency. So we've got 8 billion people on the planet, 1 billion are hungry, 2 billion are obese or overweight, but obviously some 4 billion of us are also subclinically malnourished because we're not getting these nutrients that we need. And that's having a profound effect on our preventative health. Whereas before the Second World War, yes, we had diseases, but most of them were by agents, microbial agents outside, the choleras and, diseases like that. Whereas since then, we've killed all those diseases, or not all, we've still got COVID, of course. But the point is we've managed those outside agents, but now we're killing ourselves through our compromised nutritional integrity in the food we're eating. So all these diseases we're now suffering, whether it's cancer, cardiac, diabetes, autoimmune diseases, they're all related and induced by diet-related inputs. And just as we have a microbiome in the natural soil, which we basically have killed, that used to be a selective, intelligent interface between the mineral soil, the toxic world outside, and the plant, we have exactly the same membrane microbiome inside our gut. Okay, it's exactly the same parallel where we again have these membranes that are selectively concentrating, absorbing, selectively, intelligently excluding. But by actually now destroying this in the soil and now also substantially the microbiome in our gut through antibiotics and chemical additives, we are actually losing the discrimination capacity. So we're now getting a massive input of toxic nutrients. We're breaking down that interface. We've got leaky gut syndromes whereby our guts can't discriminate as they used to. And so we're now getting into all sorts of blood, toxic blood levels, etc., because both the plants that we're eating are compromised, but also our internal microbiome has been compromised. And so we've got this enormous disease, preventative health disease issue that we've got to face. These diseases are growing by about 6% per year. They're already in the US occupying 18% of your GDP. So 18% at 6% growth rate, it's unsustainable. And so unless we rapidly re-look at how do we go to preventative health strategies based on the nutritional integrity and quality of the food we eat. We're going to, just as climate change, we're going to go off the cliff very rapidly. So the real issue again is we've got to go back from this compromised nutritional integrity story back into this natural farming system, again, rebuilding these natural protective interfaces, these intelligent interfaces between the toxic world outside and what they take up, what is in our food and what's in our guts. And so it's really coming back to these healthy, natural food systems. Healthy people need healthy food from healthy soils. And it's only these microbial interfaces that actually give us that protection. So look, with that, I wanted to sort of draw it to close and come to questions. But the bottom line is that, look, yes, we are under extreme crises, whether it's climate change, soil degradation, wildfires, preventative health diseases. But just as in nature, I mean, she just developed a very, very exquisite, sophisticated, but simple system. It's a bit of a contrast there, isn't it? But very simple system, all based on these membrane interfaces and the selective intelligent exclusion and concentration so that we were getting the essential ions. So just as 3.8 billion years ago, life evolved from that process, we now need to revisit and say, look, this is what governs life, this is what governs health, this is what governs regeneration of our biosystems, this is what governs the cooling of our climate, and we've got to embrace it. And we have agency on this. You know, we are now responsible, but we also now must take responsibility seriously. And that comes right to your talks over your conference. The natural farming processes that you're talking about are the basis of that agency. And what I've been trying to do is illustrate some of the fundamental biochemical processes, why that is so, but also the tools for regenerating that. So the challenge is, look, let's just go and do it. Our future is in our own hands. We're standing on it. It's our soil. Yes, we can. Yes, we must. So all the best. Let's go for it and let's do it. We've got 10 years. We can do it, but we've got to get started and we've got to really focus on regenerating the Earth's natural soil carbon sponge. Thank you very much.
Awesome. That was amazing. So yeah, somehow towards the end there, okay, yeah, that the video had kicked off, but that was a very impressive lecture. I mean,
yeah.
What, 4.5 billion years of planetary history and how some of the newest comers to the planet have just undone all this valuable work by the most intelligent beings on the planet, which are actually microbes, right?
Yeah, Peter. And the nice thing is, look, nature, it's just the one simple system, you know, like nothing has changed. She just took, I mean, she just had stardust, sunlight, CO2 and water, and she turned it all around on that. And it's exactly the same game. We have the same ingredients. We have the same imperative. Yes, we can. Yes, we must.
So, do you know much about the photosynthetic bacteria or the way cyanobacteria, photosynthetic bacteria, were responsible for the creation of our modern oxygen-rich environment?
Oh, well, look, yes, very simple. I mean, like, this is 3.5 billion years ago, okay? Instead of relying on chemical energy as a limited energy source, you know, breakdown of sulfides and stuff, they said we've got this solar energy. We evolved chloroplasts, right? If we evolve chloroplasts that can absorb that energy, we can use that solar energy and we can use that to break up water. And when we break that water, we can fix that with CO2 and we can create sugars. Mm-hmm. Okay, so it was 3.5 billion years ago, blue-green algae evolved, absorbing solar energy to break up a water molecule to add it on to a CO2 molecule to make sugar. And that's a biochemical process. And again, that's carried on because those blue-green algae then were basically the basis of chloroplasts, which of course really the whole green in all the plants ever since. So nothing has changed, right? That process goes on for 3.5 billion years.
Walter, Walter, if I can, I'll jump in. Well, I just got to say that was really a profound synopsis of the whole, chronological history of the planet and geochemistry and biology. I've seen other lectures, but I haven't seen you done it in such a precise synopsis like that. That was really great. And some other people are chiming in, telling you they'd love to hug you.
Well, yeah, hugs are good. No, we've got to be kind to each other, right?
So, and the other thing I wanted to mention, there's a little echo there from a couple of different talks that we've heard. And one of the things you just recently alluded there were 50 different elements that are involved in plant health. And normally, not modern science, as you know, the kind of the agricultural view from USDA, and probably SCIRO is all that there's 18 essential plant elements. But you're saying there's 50.
Look, look, okay. There's 96 natural elements in the periodic table. No one argues with that, right? And now the question is, how many are found in plants? And there's, 50, 60 found in plants. Of course, we've got macronutrients, right? The ones we know that are critical, and that's right, there's 18. But then there's a lot of micronutrients which have always been in the gray zone. Like what are they doing in the plants? What are they doing there biochemically? Now, look, we haven't worked out exactly, but research is going on. Take, for example, selenium, parts per billion. Okay, but without selenium, some plants can grow, but basically the food has got no preventative health value, because we need a selenium ion to make perioxidases, an enzyme. Okay, an enzyme has this mineral, and perioxidizers are absolutely fundamental in killing cancer cells in animals. Okay, we don't have selenium, we don't make perioxidazes, we can't kill cancer cells. Okay, so there's these very sophisticated, is it a nutrient, essential nutrient? Not for all plants, but yes, where it is found, it is profoundly important in our health. And see, this is the trouble. We've got these dozen or so, 20 nutrients that are in this gray zone that nature has got. Animals browse deliberately to get those plants, right? They'll go through a paddock and they'll just browse till they get their supplement of selenium. But we scientifically have never recorded it as an essential nutrient.
Got it. And we just had a speaker last night talking about remineralize the earth and the research that's going on around the world. And she's been doing this since the 1980s, Joanna Campi.
Yes.
Using rock dust and things.
Yes, absolutely perfect. Yeah. And look, that's essential. And this comes a little bit into, using rock dust. And then the second part of Joanna's stuff is, here's a rock dust because they're primary igneous minerals, stardust, actually fresh stardust in a way. But secondly, here are the mycorrhizal availabilities, making that, in the sponge matrix, making that nutrient available. Very profound, okay? 90% of the biofertility of soils is about the availability of that nutrient, not its content. Okay, most of the nutrients are in the soil, but they're not available. They're locked up on aluminium oxide or occluded in rocks or whatever, right? And it's making them available. And so, yes, it's adding rock dust, but it's also now these microbial membrane symbioses selectively solubilizing, selectively taking them up and bringing them into the living cycle.
Nice. By the way, another thing you mentioned that I keyed into there was your chart on the minimum amount of soil organic matter was 3%. So this echoes another talk that I gave earlier, and I mentioned that Alex Podolinsky from your country who was
Yep.
involved in biodynamics there in Australia, talked about
Big
the
time.
humus
Yeah.
law. The humus law, and he said that, and this was long before this sort of global awareness came around.
Yep.
It stated that you need a minimum of 3 to 5% for the soil to function in a natural way,
Yep.
and that you have this
Yep.
feedback system, etc.
No, look, absolutely, Steve. And basically 3% is really getting us to the functional threshold. And from then you'll get often exponentially increased growth because it multiplies, right? But look, there's nothing, I mean, yes, 3 to 5, I absolutely agree. All I'm just saying, most of our soils under agriculture are down less than 0.5, right? We've oxidized enormously. So really it's that tenfold lift out of that degrading biochemistry back into healthy cycles. So 3% is an initial target. Yes.
Nice. You mentioned this couple of farmers that are sequestering, I think you said 10 tons per hectare. 10 tons per hectare. How does that, so I translated that comes out to like 4.5 tons per acre, I think, something like that. So,
yeah, something like that, 4 tons per acre. Yep.
So who are some of these great practitioners you're thinking of, and what are they doing?
No, okay, well, very good. Look, they're just I mean, as you said, they're just in there maximizing biomass, right? So basically, we don't have fallows. We go from, for example, Colin Seiss, you might have had him across in the States talking, pasture cropping. So we'll basically graze a pasture, have plants growing there perennially, graze them down hard, intersow a wheat crop, and then basically take another wheat crop off that. And while that wheat crop's growing, all the pasture's growing back underneath again. And once he's taken the grain off, he just grazes all the stubble and the growing grass. So it's really just layering bioproductivities into systems. Vijay Kumar in Andhra Pradesh, India, again, 365-day green cover cropping, getting 3 crops a year now, where before they were getting 1, right? Because they're just using green cover crops, intercrop all the time. So we're just maximizing but also we're using it to give us the fertility, the water holding capacity, so we don't have to use the oxidative additions. We don't have that fertilizer, etc., that then converts a lot of that back into CO2.
Nice.
But look, I mean, we can go higher. I mean, we've got sugarcane that does 200 tons of biomass per hectare per annum above ground at the optimum, right? 200 tons. And so putting 70% of that biomass, that subsoil biomass, into soil carbon, we can do that enormously, massively, way beyond 10 tons. But look, that's a ridiculous target to put to people. I mean, obviously 10 ton aspirationally, but even if they're doing 5 tons per hectare per annum, hey, yes, you're doing well. Congratulations.
I'm sure you're familiar with the paper circular chromatograms that the Pfeiffer people. Yes. Okay. So just as a point of comparison, how sugarcane is grown in the United States, it was an organic farming conference in Louisiana. And one of the consultants got with me on the side and showed me a chromatogram from a very conventional, chemically driven sugarcane farm with zero imagery on the chromatogram.
No.
There was nothing. The soil literally had nothing in it.
No, literally. And you're basically saying, look, this is just a substrate to hold the plant up, and we're going 100% hydroponically. Basically, they're putting on 200 kilograms of nitrate per hectare per annum, right? To keep that grass growing.
Right.
Whereas sugarcane grew, you see, without any fertilizer naturally, right? It's a grass monoculture. It was all asymbiotic nitrogen-fixing organism, Azotobacter, Azospirillum, blue-green algae, fixing 20, 30 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per annum. That's all the sugarcane needed continually. But of course, we're dousing it now with basically 200 because we've got to add it at the beginning of the rotation, but then it runs out halfway through because it's all leached and volatilized. So yeah, we're really very primitive in that nutritional nitrogen economy on some of these crops. We're losing 80% of what we're putting on because of the inappropriate. See, the plant needs the right nutrients at the right time in the right place in the right form, and we're just not meeting that at all. We're wasting 80% of what we're putting on.
I'll just throw an idea out that came to me while you were talking, and I'm not really big on policy. I'm more into helping farmers on technology and empowering farmers. But one way to kind of shift and change the way that government subsidies are done, that in some ways really it drives how farmers react and how they farm. We're rewarding farmers for doing things the improper way. It's working against this equation that you're referring to. But if we started rewarding for, soil health indicators, like how much mycorrhizae have you produced on your farm, how much carbon have you sequestered, and then we shift the subsidies on that end, we could bring this around faster, probably.
Yeah. Okay. My point here is very much that, look, we've got a $10 trillion a year global industrial food system, and basically they're sourcing their supplies from farmers. 2 trillion tons, roughly $2 trillion perhaps a year is what they're paying them. And so they've got a very protected, subsidized system going their way. So us lobbying government to say, hey, we want you to change. We've got this Herculean job. How do we bust the existing protection rackets? And the better thing is to simply say, in my opinion, is to say, look, we can't afford all this protection. We can't afford all these subsidies. We're destroying our land. If we look at the externality costs of our destruction of our land and put that on the balance sheet, we've got to change. And then if we're costing the real cost of the externalities and the protection and the subsidies, then withdraw them, then logic of natural farming will just stand out, 500%. Okay, so rather going cap in hand to people to say, we want you to give incentives and subsidies to support what we want to do, I think we should just be costing the real cost of the stupidity that we're involved with. And then you say, well, what have we got as an alternative? Hey, nature's got these smarter, sharper, far more efficient solutions.
Good. We're gonna call you up to the Congressional Committee on Agriculture.
Yeah, no, look, certainly. And I mean, we're all getting to that space. Look, in the health game, you've got 18% of US GDP going into health costs, right? That whole disease industry. It's not health, it's a disease industry, right? It's growing at 6% per year, 6 to 8% per year. How long is Biden going to be able to keep that going? You can't. So he's got to say, look, how do we actually get back to social preventative health? Okay, and that's healthy food from healthy soils. And so what's the cost? It's some trillions, tens of trillions of dollars per year that you're heading into. And so, yes, I can avoid that cost, but only by investing in healthy soils, healthy food, healthy people, natural farming.
So I want to bring out the seaweed angle, because there's a question about any single nutritional supplement or food that would be recommended to replenish the nutrients we are missing from our free radical based agriculture.
Yep.
And right now we were going to have Ryan Drum speaking until for whatever reason he had to excuse himself, but he was going to speak on medicinal seaweed. It was, I believe, called seaweed cultivation, seaweeds for food and medicine. And I know that even there's 92 minerals that actually we need for all our enzymatic processes. So far we know it's 50, but one of it's really all 92 that's already in the ocean. And
right. Yep. No, look, perfect. I mean, obviously, yes, the oceans is a sink for all the nutrients that are leached from the land, right? And so, yes, there's a residual sink. The nutrients haven't left the planet off to space. Some helium has, but basically, the stardust is all here, right?
Right.
And whatever's soluble is in the oceans. And yes, he's right. There's 92. It comes into Stephen's point, where's the line between 18 and 92? But definitely there's 92 minerals in the oceans. Some of them, of course, we don't need, obviously. But anyway, okay, so the point is seaweed, absolutely an exquisitely efficient food source because it's concentrating all these natural nutrients that have washed off the land.
And isn't sharing egg dates.
Yeah. So no, it's absolutely. So we're getting those nutrients. And now, yes, of course, we're taking those. All I'm saying there is, how well adapted are we to eating all of them? And that's where our microbiome in our gut becomes critically important, right?
Right.
Because no troubles with eating them as long as we've got a healthy gut, because then our gut membranes will selectively take what they need from the seaweed that we've eaten and excrete what we don't want, right? Now, what we don't know is, what I'm saying, we can't just say, look, let's make a concoction, a pill of these seaweed nutrients and then feed everyone that nutrient, because we could be going way over concentrations. I mean, take something like selenium again. Look, it's toxic in excess. Mm-hmm. It's toxic in not toxic, it's deadly in deficiency. There's a sweet spot, right? Concentration. And it also varies at different times. And so that's really where our gut microbiome is, our intelligent quality control system that regulates that. It'll take from our, the gut content that we've got, it'll take what it needs. If the membranes, the villi in our gut are controlled, just as the mycorrhizae are in the soil.
Right.
But we break that system with two excess chemicals. We can't discriminate, and before you know what, we've got excessive ions in our blood, and then we end up with all sorts of biochemical problems.
Okay, so there's some comments coming in on the chat, and so let me just go through one of them. This is one of our panelists is Lala Gardens, and they are saying that they work with facultative anaerobes that live in clay that have interesting properties. That it increases the soil's ability to hold water and make available. And then insects are attracted to this clay. And I think there's a comment there about terrestrial chitin and so forth. So I don't know. I'm not quite sure on that. That's quite interesting, actually, Lala Gardens. We should find out more from you. But any comment on that?
Oh, yeah. Look, and this is petagenesis, obviously in different situations. So you've got a clay, right, anaerobic. So it's got limited life initially. And so here are those facultative organisms starting to colonize that, leaving behind glucosamine as they grow through the thing, which is a chitin you're talking about, right? Because chitin is glucosamine, right, made up of glucosamine. So it's actually fungal cell walls being left behind as they're growing through the clay. But of course, then other animals are already able to eat that clay. The fungi have solubilized some of the minerals from the clay. They've left behind glucosamine, which is a carbon substrate. So it already becomes, in a sense, now a food source for the next successional organism, converting that progressively back into healthy soils. So totally consistent with what we're talking about. While we look, it's again, I must make the point. I'm talking about fungi as a key primary agent in all this, but it's only one part of a very complex soil biota. Most of the other biota, in fact, there's bacteria, actinomyces, but most of the other biota actually living off the fungi. So they're basically eating the fungi, or they're eating the fungal detritus and cell walls. And so it's just compounding from that, right? So the worms, the protozoa, all that sort of stuff, they're living off the primary fungal and bacteria protein and nutrients created.
Very good. Well, we should probably mention, if you talk about mycorrhizae, we should probably mention David Dowd's work at USDA. He's the scientist who has shown farmers how to propagate mycorrhizae on the farm.
Yep.
By growing host plants, buying some mycorrhizal inoculant from a company, for example, and growing some different host crops in pots and containers with vermiculite and a little bit of compost, not too much.
Yep.
No. You want to hold back the phosphorus. And after the growing season is done, this potting mix is completely full of a brand new, huge, massive amount of mycorrhizal inoculant that you can then grow your transplants with, like peppers and tomatoes and so forth, and plant them in the field, and boom, you have instantly improved the mycorrhizae benefit.
Yeah, look, Stephen, yes, I mean, my project in CSIRO in the 70s was all about mycorrhizae. We had the oil crisis. It was all about how do we use mycorrhizae as an alternative to phosphorus fertilizer. I mean, we still needed the phosphorus, but could we get a tenfold availability of phosphorus through mycorrhizal management, which is what I spent about 5 years on. And yes, we can. And yes, exactly that. We can actually isolate mycorrhizae. 98% of plants are mycorrhizal, but often the activity in the field soils are very, very repressed, right? And so it becomes an issue of, yes, we can isolate them, but how do we actually stimulate their activity? And what he's shown in the way he's cultured them, again, vermiculite, limited nutrients, the right conditions, but particularly proper nurse plants. You know, they need the roots of the nurse plants. Yes, you can rebuild those mycorrhizae. The powerful message behind it is, yes, we can regenerate these interfaces, these symbiotic interfaces in our agroecologies rapidly by just basically saying, right, what are the limiting factors? How do we stimulate these processes? And as in nature, then off they go.
A lot of this is about, which is a perfect theme with the Nature Farming Conference, is building the habitat.
Yes.
It's the proper management of keeping the soil covered with living crops, with dead mulch, minimizing disturbance of the soil, providing these carbon inputs, letting nature take its course. But from my perspective as a soils guy and helping farmers, there's some value to the inputs too. So you can really jumpstart a system by getting some inputs, put them in there, make them all work together. Like, for example, rock dust. You're not going to get rock dust off your farm.
No, exactly right.
And you have to bring it from somewhere else.
Look, the microbial ecology, any organism, 3 factors govern it. Obviously, one is the genetics. Have I got the genetic capacity? But often that's there latent, very repressed. But then the big stimulating factors, have I got the substrates? Have I got the right food sources, which is mostly root exudates from plants for these symbionts? And then, as you say, what are the right conducive environmental conditions in that soil? Aeration, moisture, rock dust, the minor nutrients. And then also very interesting, this whole field of biostimulants. Where are there additives that switch on the activity? For example, in Vijay Kumar, again, Andhra Pradesh, zero budget natural farming. I think Palika is going to be talking about it later. And it's basically saying, look, here is the dung of animals. And of course, people say, oh, look, there's not enough nutrients in this dung to drive the productivity that you're claiming. And no one's saying the nutrients in the dung are providing the nutrients. What they're doing is they're providing the biostimulants to the organisms that then fix and solubilize the nutrients. So they're acting as switches, right? They're switching on these processes rather than supplying it as quantity, right? So it's this whole mentality of not more on agriculture, but simply switching on, stimulating these natural processes.
I think it must be Paul Oliver. Yes, saying that.
Oh, look,
rock
I
dust-
can't read the chat, so please,
Okay,
Stephen, you
yeah,
ask
so-
the question because I can only see the
Yes.
introduction to those questions. Yeah.
So Paul Oliver, one of the panelists, is making a point that rock dust should be returned to the soil via transformed waste.
Yes.
So
yes.
that's a really good thing. Is adding rock dust to some compost or to some bokashi or some fermentation process.
Yeah.
Let the microbes work it over, make it more mineralized and solubilized, chelated, put it back in the soil. The plants will grab onto it.
Stephen, we add rock dust to our feed pellets. Okay, like if we're looking at broadacre rangeland agro ecosystems, we'll say, look, here's some supplementary feed pellets that we can give the animals. And we've got literally, a couple of grams of rock dust, and then the animals are eating those. Their microbiome is taking what the animal needs to supplement its nutrition. The rest is excreted out, and bang, it's fertilizing, re-nutrifying that whole landscape with those trace elements.
I think biochars, it probably fits the same way. It should be put through a process.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. Because otherwise you've just got a carbon lattice matrix, which nothing wrong with it, but until it's actually fortified with nutrients and put into that right environment, also the embodied cost of reincorporating into soil becomes prohibitive.
I just got to say that's the difference between practitioners and academics. The biochar world is a perfect example of that. What the academics are doing on biochar is very scientific and finding out all kinds of details, but practitioners are way ahead of that because they've already figured this part out. And they're going from like, let's put on 25 tons or 50 tons per acre. And the bio practitioners are like, let's put on 500 pounds.
Yeah, exactly. No,
that's all. It's all biologically made up, and nutrients are in there.
Look, totally agree. No, we're just switching on. See, this is so important because the task we have is enormous. Coming back to India, for example, we're now saying, look, we'll look bigger globally. We have created 5 billion hectares of man-made desert and wasteland on this planet. There's only 14 billion hectares of land on the planet, right? 40% is turned into wasteland, desert. And so we've got a massive job of how do we actually regenerate? We can't do all of it, of course, but is there 1 billion hectares of wasteland that we need to put back to 365-day green cover from a rehydration, cooling, that perspective? So 1 billion hectares, that's the area of the United States, right? And if we're doing things at that scale, we're not going to add so many tons per hectare, but we can add, we can add 50 grams per hectare. And that's the difference. We've got to switch on these natural processes and really reboot these natural ecologies.
Walter, thank you so much. We're wrapping it up here because we got to go on.
Pleasure,
to the next speaker, but we're gonna fist bump you and give you a high five. People can jump up. Everybody's everyone's jumping up. We need this. We love this.
Okay, Stephen. Now, look, just as a conclusion, if there's further questions or other questions arise out of the conference, look, please, write down the questions, send them to me, electronic, email, and stuff, right? And certainly we can keep the dialogue going as a Q&A, answering these questions. And as particularly if there's particular topics of contention, like really, or people want to get into the guts of something more, we can have small Zoom webinars around different problem solving on different elements, right?
Awesome.
Definitely I'm not skimmed, but I've gone very quickly over some very complicated, sophisticated things.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Okay, well, look, excellent. And look, everyone, thank you very much, and enjoy the conference, and let's just keep on regenerating that sponge. Thank you.
For sure. I would like to invite you. In 4 hours, we're doing another 3-hour roundtable. I know you said you were busy in the afternoon.
No, 4 hours. I've got it's World Soil Day today, you see, so I've got an interview at 4 p.m. here. 4 p.m. here, but so 4 hours from now, is it?
Yeah, we are doing
well,
our
look,
round table.
I should be able to make it 4 hours from now because that should be 2 o'clock. But then at 4 p.m. our time, I'll have to leave and join the
no worries.
media interview. Okay.
Well, thank you so much. That was awesome.
It's the same Zoom link. Okay.
Yeah, exactly the same.
And now when you say 4 hours from 9:30 this morning or
from the time we're both at. Exactly. Everyone right now, 4 hours from wherever you are in the world, 4 hours.
From now.
From now.
Now. Okay.
Yep.
4 hours from now. Okay. Do that. Be on. Right?
Well,
all the best.
Rock and roll.
Okay. Thank you, Peter. All the best. Bye-bye.
All the best.
Bye.